The courtroom smelled like old paper and central heating that had been running too long. Dorothy Hargrove stood at the plaintiff's table with a folder of documents pressed against her chest, and across the room 3 men in navy suits sat with the particular stillness of people who had been paid a great deal of money to appear calm. The lead attorney, a man named Marcus Webb, had a jaw like poured concrete and eyes that moved across the room the way security cameras move, methodical and without warmth. He looked at Dorothy once, then looked away the way people look away from things they have already decided do not matter. Dorothy was 67 years old. She had brown eyes behind silver-framed glasses and gray hair she kept short because she had always preferred practicality over performance. Her hands resting on the folder were the hands of a woman who had spent decades lifting, carrying, arranging, and building, and if you look closely, you could see the slight callus on her right index finger from 30 years of writing inventory numbers in the ledger books of an antique shop. She had opened herself in a building she had made into something with money. Her mother had left her in a vision that had belonged entirely to her. The judge had not entered yet. The room was still settling into the particular silence that courtrooms produce just before things become official. Dorothy did not look at the 3 men across from her. She looked at the folder in her hands, and she thought about 8 months ago, which felt in some ways like 100 years, and in other ways like last Tuesday. She thought about a Tuesday because it had been a Tuesday. 8 months ago, she had not been standing in a courtroom. She had been sitting in a small office with beige walls and a clock that made the sound clocks make when no one is speaking. She had been sitting across from her husband of 42 years, and he had been explaining something to her in the measured, reasonable tone of a man presenting a business proposal to a board that had already voted yes. She had not known the vote had already happened. That was the part she kept returning to, not with bitterness anymore, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand the precise mechanism of how something breaks. Not the dramatic break, the argument, the slammed door, the moment of heat and noise. The quiet kind, the kind that happens over months and years in the background of ordinary days while you are making dinner and running a shop and trusting that the life you see is the life that exists. She thought about that Tuesday. And then, because the judge had still not entered, she let herself think about all of it one more time from the beginning. Richard Hargrove was 71 years old and had the silver hair and steady posture of a man who had always believed that how you appeared in a room was at least half of what you actually were. He was a financial advisor by profession, which meant he understood better than most people how money moves and where it hides and what you can do with paperwork if you understand paperwork well enough and trust that the person across from you does not. He had placed the documents on the table with both hands, neatly the way you set down something you have been carrying for a long time and are relieved to finally put somewhere permanent. Dorothy had looked at the stack. She had not touched it right away. Something in the way he sat, the particular quality of his stillness, told her that there was no version of this conversation where she would open those pages and find something she wanted to find. So she sat with that knowledge for a moment, the way you stand outside in cold air before you go back inside, knowing the warmth is there but not yet ready to move. Then she picked up the first page. The house on Ridgemont Drive, the house where they had lived for 28 years, where she had painted the kitchen twice and planted the rose bushes along the fence and kept the spare key under the clay pot by the back steps, had always been in Richard's name alone. She had not known this. She had assumed, as people who have been married 42 years tend to assume, that what was his was also hers and what was hers was also his. Assumptions are not the same as facts. She was learning this now in a beige office on a Tuesday in October at the age of 67. The antique shop, Hargrove and Company, which she had opened in 1989 in a garage on the east side of Portland with $18,000 that her mother had left her, specifically her mother's careful handwriting on the accompanying letter, making the specificity unmistakable to you, Dorothy, for something of your own. The shop was in Richard's name, had been in Richard's name since 2009, when there had been some paperwork about restructuring, and she had signed what he set in front of her because she had signed what he set in front of her for decades and had never had a reason to read before signing. The savings accounts, the retirement funds, each item she turned to was another room she had thought was hers, and each time she opened the door, it turned out the room had always belonged to someone else. She had looked up at him when she reached the bottom of the stack. She had not cried. She was not sure why, except that what she felt was not grief, but something colder and more precise, a kind of understanding that was arriving all at once and leaving no room for anything softer. "When did you start preparing this?" she asked. Richard picked up his coffee cup. He drank from it without hurry. He set it down. "That doesn't matter," he said. "It matters to me. You didn't have your name on those accounts because you didn't create those accounts," he said. "I made the money, Dorothy. You helped me." There were words she could have said. She had thought of several since in the weeks after in the temporary rooms in the middle of the night when sleep would not stay. But what she had done in that moment was go very quiet and very still, because the words he had said were not cruel in the way cruelty usually presents itself. They were not screamed or sneered. They were stated, and that was the thing about them that she could not get past, not the content, but the delivery, the flat certainty of a man who had been believing this for years and saw no reason to soften it. She had signed the papers. Not because she agreed, not because she was defeated. She had signed them because she had understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water that there was no argument to be had in this room. Everything had already been decided. The room itself, the neat stack, the prepared signature, lines, all of it was the end of something, not the middle. You do not negotiate in the ruins. You walk out of them. She was reaching for her coat when she heard Richard say something to the attorney in a lowered voice, something he perhaps thought she was already too far away to hear. 3 words. Faster than expected. She did not turn around. She put on her coat. She walked out of the office and into the October air and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. She memorized those 3 words the way you memorize a face. The 3 weeks that followed were the kind of weeks she did not like to examine too closely, not because they were dramatic, but because they were the opposite, flat and gray, and full of the small humiliations of a person whose life has been reduced to a suitcase and a phone and a list of places to stay that all felt like waiting rooms. A rental room with thin walls and the smell of someone else's laundry detergent. Her sister Patricia's couch, where Patricia asked every morning in the careful tone of a woman trying very hard to be helpful whether Dorothy had thought about calling Richard to talk things through. Patricia meant well. Patricia always meant well. That was the specific challenge of Patricia. A week at a Motel 6 off Highway 30, where the bathroom mirror had a crack shaped like the letter V, and the television picked up 4 channels clearly and 6 more in a way that made everything look like it was happening underwater. Dorothy did not look in mirrors during those weeks, not because she was avoiding her age, because the face in the mirror was the face of a woman who did not know where she lived, and she was not ready to look at that woman for longer than necessary. She walked. That was the thing she did when the rooms became too small and the silence became too specific. She walked without direction, which was new for her because she had spent most of her adult life walking toward things, toward the shop, toward the particular shelf where a piece she was looking for was waiting toward the next item on a list. Walking without a list felt strange at first, and then gradually felt like the only honest thing she was doing. She also called the shop once on a Wednesday morning from a payphone outside a coffee place on Division Street. She had not planned to call. Her feet had simply stopped in front of the phone, and her hand had put the coins in before her thinking mind had weighed the decision. A woman answered, young voice efficient, the voice of someone who had been trained on the register and knew where the good pieces were kept. Dorothy listened to her say Hargrove and Company good morning for 4 seconds, then hung up without speaking. She stood on the sidewalk with her hands still on the receiver and understood that the person who had answered that phone had probably not been told anything about who had built the place she was now working in. The erasure was that complete. On a gray afternoon in late October, she was walking on Burnside, not looking at anything in particular when she stopped. The office was small, wedged between a laundromat and a Turkish bread shop, the kind of storefront that had probably been 6 different things in the last 20 years and would be 6 more things in the next 20. The window was cluttered with notices and listings, most of them sun-faded and curling at the corners. Dorothy's eyes moved over them without real attention. Rooms for rent, used furniture, a lost cat notice that had been there long enough that the cat was probably either found or gone for good. Then she stopped. One notice was different from the others. White paper, clean type, not faded. Property for sale, $3, 14 Alderman Street, Portland East. Dorothy read it twice, then a third time. Then she pushed open the door. The man inside was perhaps 60, with the face of someone who had spent a career watching other people make decisions and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. His name, according to the small placard on his desk, was Walter Pruitt. He looked up when Dorothy came in, and something happened in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of attention that had not been there a moment before. Like a man who has been waiting at a particular junction and has just seen the person he was expecting come around the corner. "The listing in the window," Dorothy said. "The one for $3. "Yes, that's a real listing." "It is." "Why $3? Walter Pruitt set down the pen he was holding. He folded his hands on the desk, which was covered in papers, arranged in the organized chaos of a person who knew exactly where everything was, but would be unable to explain the system to anyone else. $3 is the minimum legally valid consideration for a real property transfer in Oregon when the title carries historical dispute status, he said, not reading from anything. Stating it the way you state something you have known for a longer time and have been waiting for the right occasion to say. Dorothy looked at him carefully. "You know a great deal about this particular listing. I've been waiting for someone to ask the right question." "What's the right question?" "You just asked it." He pulled a drawer open and took out a piece of paper. He wrote an address on it with a deliberate hand and pushed it across the desk. Then he looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided to trust someone and has made that decision carefully and is not going to explain the reasoning behind it. "Don't tell anyone you're buying it," he said. "Not yet." Dorothy picked up the paper. She almost asked why, but there was something in the way he said "not yet," the particular weight of those two words. The implication that there was a right time for knowing, and this was not yet it, that stopped the question before it left her mouth. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and walked back out onto Burnside, thinking about a man who kept a $3 listing in his window and spoke about it like a man who had been tending something that was not yet ready to be harvested. She walked 3 blocks before she stopped and stood on the sidewalk and asked herself clearly and without sentimentality what she was actually doing. She had no stable address. She had a suitcase and a prepaid debit card and a sister who was running out of patience and sympathy in roughly equal measure. She was not in a position to buy property. She was not in a position to take on anything that would require sustained attention and resources she did not have. And yet the piece of paper with the address on it was in her coat pocket, and she was already calculating which bus line went to the east side. She had spent 42 years being practical. She had been practical about the shop, practical about the house, practical about the marriage and the finances and the decisions that accumulated over decades into the shape of a life. And the shape of the life she had been practical about had turned out to belong entirely to someone else. Perhaps she thought there was something to be said for being impractical. Just once, just to see what it felt like. She went the next afternoon. Alderman Street was in the eastern part of Portland, a neighborhood of houses built mostly in the 1940s, the kind of street where some properties were well kept and others showed the particular wear of people who were managing, but only just. The houses had a settled quality, the look of places that had been through enough to stop being surprised. Number 14 was impossible to miss. The paint had not so much peeled as surrendered, coming away from the wood in long, curling strips that caught the afternoon light and made the house look like something in the process of shedding its skin. 3 of the upper windows were broken, the glass mostly gone, but for jagged pieces still clinging to the frames, patient and dangerous. The front porch sagged on the right side where a support had given way, not all the way down, but enough to give the whole structure a lopsided, exhausted quality, as if it had been leaning into a wind that had stopped blowing some years ago and had simply not found the energy to straighten up again. The yard had passed through overgrown and was somewhere beyond it, the grass and weeds chest-high in places, tangled with climbing plants that had sent long tentacles up the porch posts and along the eaves, slow and patient, pulling the house toward the earth 1 inch at a time. Dorothy stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time. She was not an impulsive woman. She had spent a professional life evaluating things before committing to them, turning objects over in her hands, checking the joints, reading the grain, looking at the underside before agreeing on a price. What she was doing now was the same thing she had always done. She was looking before she decided. A door opened at the house next door, number 16. A woman came out carrying a bag of trash, moving with the efficiency of someone who had performed this particular errand several thousand times. She was perhaps 58, with short salt and pepper hair, and a face that held the particular arrangement of features common to people who have decided that life is generally more trouble than advertised and have made their peace with this fact. The woman stopped when she saw Dorothy. She set the trash bag down. "You here to look at the house?" she said. "I'm here to buy it," Dorothy said. The woman was quieter for a moment. She studied Dorothy the way people study something they are trying to place, fitting it into a category, checking if the category holds. "My name is Carolyn Marsh," she said. "I've lived at 16 for 22 years. Dorothy Hargrove." "Harold Finch lived there," Carolyn said. She nodded toward the number 14. "Moved in around 1974. Lived there alone most of that time. Then in 1991, he was gone. Just gone. No obituary, no moving truck. The police said he'd probably wandered off on his own, said some people do that when they get old, said it wasn't a matter for investigation. He was 73. He didn't own a car." Dorothy looked at the house. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in 22 years, I've watched about a dozen people stand exactly where you're standing, look at that house, and then leave, usually within 10 minutes. I want to know which number you are." "I haven't left yet," Dorothy said. She stepped over the low fence and walked toward the house. She heard Carolyn behind her, not following, just watching. She could feel the watching. It was a particular kind of attention. The kind that is not hostile but is not warm. Either the attention of someone making an assessment and reserving judgment until the evidence is in. What Dorothy felt when she stood in the yard was difficult to name. She was not given to the kind of language that described intangible connections between people and places. She was practical by nature. She had spent her professional life handling objects, evaluating their age and condition and worth. And she knew that objects did not have feelings, and the feelings people assigned to them were their own feelings bounced off the surface of things and reflected back. But she stood in the yard of number 14 and felt something that she would have been embarrassed to say aloud to anyone, which was that this house reminded her of herself. Not because it was damaged, because it had been deliberately set aside. Not destroyed, not fought over, just placed outside the circle of consideration and left there. And eventually people had stopped seeing it because they had decided it wasn't worth seeing, and the decision had become habit, and the habit had calcified into certainty, and now the certainty was so old that most people had forgotten there had ever been a decision at all. They thought it had always been this way. Dorothy knew something about that. She walked around to the back of the house before leaving. The yard behind was smaller than she had expected, bounded on the south by a wooden fence that was leaning in several places. And beyond the fence, perhaps 40 feet away, the brick wall of a large commercial building rose 4 stories without windows on the ground level. The building had the look of something built without particular interest in its neighbors, the architecture of people who had acquired the land they needed and had not considered what was adjacent to it. She noted this without yet knowing why she was noting it, the way you sometimes notice a detail that does not mean anything yet, but stores itself efficiently for later. The fence itself was interesting. It ran along what she assumed was the property boundary, but one section had clearly been pushed inward, at some point the post no longer vertical, leaning back toward the house rather than straight down, as if something had pressed against them from the other side over a long period of time. The grass between the fence and the commercial wall was the same overgrown tangle as the front yard, but there was something underneath it, a line of old concrete at the base of the commercial building's wall that extended further than the fence did. She could see the edge of it through the weeds. She did not know what it meant. She was an antique dealer, not a surveyor. But she looked at it for a moment before she left, filing it with the other things she did not yet have words for. She went back to Walter Pruitt the following morning with 3 $1 bills in an envelope. He processed the paperwork with a speed that suggested he had prepared for this, had the forms ready, knew exactly which boxes needed which information. When she asked about the history of the dispute, the legal complication that had made the price what it was, he looked at her with the careful expression of a man deciding how much to say and settling on less than he knew. "Boundary question," he said. "Never properly resolved. Someone should have dealt with it years ago and nobody did." She waited to see if he would add anything. He did not. He gave her a key, a heavy old thing that was slightly too large for its age, and she walked out onto Burnside with a key in her pocket and the address of a house that was hers, and the particular feeling of having stepped into something whose full dimensions she had not yet taken. The first night was cold. She had known it would be cold. There was no functioning heating system and 3 broken windows and the kind of gaps around door frames that are invisible in summer and become characters in their own right once the temperature drops. She spread the blankets she had brought on the floor of the main room and sat in the dark with a small flashlight because the electricity had been disconnected long enough ago that the reconnection would require a process she had not yet begun. She sat in the dark and listened to the house. It made sounds. Old houses always do. The particular conversation between wood and temperature change the small adjustments and protests that buildings make when they are left to themselves. She had been in enough old buildings to know the difference between the sounds of a structure failing and the sounds of a structure simply being present, and what she heard that night was the second kind. She did not cry. She noted this without making too much of it. 3 weeks of temporary rooms, and she had cried in most of them the particular exhausted crying of someone who is not sure precisely what they are crying about, but knows there is something that needs releasing. In this house in the dark, she felt something different. Not peace exactly, but the absence of a specific pressure. There was nothing in this house that reminded her of a life that had turned out to belong to someone else. No drawer she had filled and someone else had emptied. No chair that held the particular dent of a particular person. No smell, no history with her in it. She took the toothbrush out of her bag. She found the one working faucet in the kitchen, which produced cold water with conviction, if not warmth. She brushed her teeth in the dark, standing at a sink in a kitchen that was not yet hers in any real sense, but was more hers than anything she had stood in for 3 weeks. It was a small thing. She was aware of how small it was, but it was the first small thing she had done for no reason except that it was the next thing to do with no one watching, with no obligation attached in a house that had no expectations of her at all. She slept on the floor and woke up with light coming through the gap where the curtains had been and had not been replaced. The second day, she found a broom in the closet under the stairs. It was old and the bristles were splayed, and it would need replacing, but it worked well enough for the purposes of beginning. She started in the main room and worked toward the back. She was not operating according to a plan. She was simply doing the next visible thing, which is a different kind of order than planning, but can sometimes get you further. At 10 in the morning, Carolyn Marsh appeared at the fence line between the two properties. She was holding 2 mugs. She set one on the top rail of the fence without saying anything and stood with the other one. Dorothy set down the broom and walked over and picked up the mug. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what she needed. They stood on either side of the fence and drank without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. When they finished, Carolyn took both mugs back without comment and went inside, and Dorothy returned to her broom. Something had shifted between them in those few minutes. Not a friendship yet, but the beginning of a mutual acknowledgement that each of them was a person who got on with things, and that there was a measure of respect available in that shared quality if neither of them pushed too hard on it. In the afternoon, pulling up the old carpet in the dining room, Dorothy saw the floor underneath. She was not expecting much from the floor. She was expecting what floors under old carpets generally look like: boards warped by decades of unregulated temperature and moisture, stained and scuffed and needing significant work. She got most of that. But at the edge of the dining room where the carpet met the wall, she found something different. The boards there were old, but they were not damaged in the same way as the others. And on the underside of the carpet, pressed face down against the wood, there was a mark. She had to crouch close to read it. Someone had written on the floor in pencil, carefully, with what she realized now had been a straight edge. The letters were that neat. HF, 1987, do not sell. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a while. Harold Finch, writing his initials into the floor of his own house in 1987, 4 years before he disappeared. Not in anger, not in desperation, with a ruler. The third day, she moved into the dining room proper. The light was best there in the late afternoon, coming in from the west window at an angle that made the room almost warm. She was clearing away the last of the broken furniture when she noticed it. A single floorboard near the center of the room sat differently from the others. Not damaged, not warped or raised by moisture. Just slightly precisely different from its neighbors, the way a book placed back on a shelf by someone other than its owner sits at a marginally wrong angle that the owner would notice immediately. She got the old screwdriver from the pile of tools she had found in the garage and worked it into the gap along the edge of the board. She applied pressure. The board resisted in the way things resist when they have been undisturbed for a long time but were always meant to be moved. Then it gave with a sharp, clean crack that sent a small cloud of dust into the afternoon light. Underneath, a hollow space perhaps 30 centimeters deep, lined with dark cloth that had once been some kind of felt, and was now only the memory of felt. And inside the space, a metal box roughly the size of a shoebox, but heavier green paint, faded to the color of old moss, a small lock on the front that had rusted solid. Dorothy lifted it out. The weight surprised her. Not the weight of something empty, the weight of something that had been carefully filled. She set it on the floor in the afternoon light. She looked at the top of it. Under a thin film of dust scratched into the metal with something sharp were three letters. HWF, Harold Walter Finch, she would learn later. But in that moment, she only knew the initials, and she only knew the feeling that settled over her as she sat in the broken light of his dining room, holding a box he had hidden, and waited and hoped and finally left for someone he would never meet. She did not open it immediately. She set it on the one table she had salvaged from the debris, the legs uneven but the surface solid, and she sat across from it in the diminishing light of a late October afternoon. She had learned something in 42 years of marriage about the value of not rushing toward the next thing, about the strange peace of sitting with something you do not yet understand and allowing yourself to not yet understand it. For the first time in weeks, she felt curious, not about what she had lost, about what might come next. She left the box on the table and went to sleep on the floor with that thought, which was small and quiet and the most alive she had felt in longer than she could easily remember. She opened the box at first light. She had not planned to wait until morning. She had fallen asleep sitting upright in the chair with her hands folded in her lap and the metal box 3 feet away on the salvage table. And when she woke, the room was gray with early light, and the box was still there, patient and unchanged. And she understood that she had needed the night between finding it and opening it the way you sometimes need sleep between hearing bad news and deciding what to do about it. Except this was not bad news. She did not know yet what it was. The lock had rusted completely through. She worked at it for 20 minutes with the screwdriver and a pair of pliers she found in the garage pile, and when it finally gave, it did not open dramatically. It simply stopped being closed. Inside, there were 3 things. A bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been blue and was now the pale gray of something that had been blue for so long it had forgotten. A collection of folded documents, perhaps 8 or 10 sheets, the paper gone amber at the edges in the way paper goes when decades have worked on it, slowly and without malice. And on top of everything else placed there last, and with obvious intention, a sealed white envelope. The seal had held. The envelope had survived whatever the box had survived. On the front, in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal, the kind of handwriting that men of a certain generation were taught in school and either kept or abandoned. The ink faded but perfectly legible. To whoever finally stays. Dorothy sat with that for a moment. Not the mystery of it, but the particular weight of those 4 words. Someone had written them knowing they would not be the one to read the response. Knowing that the person who eventually opened this box would be a stranger. And they had written finally, which meant they had understood that many people would come before and none of them would stay. And they were writing past all of those people to the one who would. She opened the envelope carefully, working the flap loose without tearing it. The letter was 2 pages written in the same careful hand, dated October 1989. She read it once quickly, the way you read something when you need to know if it changes everything before you can afford to look at it closely. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the gray morning. Then she picked it up and read it again slowly, the way it deserved. Harold Walter Finch had bought the property at 14 Alderman Street in 1974, along with the lot around it, which at that time included not just the footprint of the house and its yard, but a strip of land running along the southern edge of the property, extending to a boundary line clearly marked in the county survey of 1978. He had the survey documents. They were in the box, folded and amber-edged, but legible. In 1982, a development company called Caldwell Wren had purchased the vacant lot directly south and east of his property and begun construction on a commercial building. They called it Meridian Plaza. It was 4 stories brick-faced, and it was built, Harold wrote, with the particular confidence of people who are accustomed to not being questioned. During construction, the foundation of the building was poured 40 feet beyond the legal boundary of their property, consuming 40 feet of Harold's land along the southern edge. That 40 feet, once it was under concrete and rebar, and eventually a commercial parking structure, was simply no longer available to argue about. Harold had argued about it anyway. He had gone to the county. A records official named Thomas Burke had shown him an updated boundary map and explained in the tone of a person who has delivered this explanation before that the records reflected the actual property lines, and that if Harold had questions about the prior survey, he was welcome to submit a formal inquiry. Harold had submitted the inquiry. It had not been answered. He had hired a lawyer. The lawyer had taken a retainer of $3,000, met with Harold twice, and then stopped returning calls. When Harold went to the office in person, the receptionist told him the attorney was unavailable and that the matter had been evaluated and found to lack sufficient grounds for litigation. The $3,000 was not returned. He had gone back to the records office and asked to see the original 1978 survey, the one he had a copy of in his own files, the one that showed the boundary clearly. Burke had told him the original documents were currently in a processing backlog related to a departmental digitization project. Burke had not made eye contact when he said this. Harold's letter was not written with the shaking rage of a man who had been robbed. It was written with the resigned precision of a man who had understood what had happened, understood that he lacked the means or the connections or the particular kind of documented proof that survives the specific ways that documented proof tends to disappear, and had made the only decision left to him. He had hidden what he had: the original 1978 survey, copies of his correspondence with Burke's office, the retainer agreement with the attorney who had vanished, a photograph of the construction in progress taken from his own yard showing the concrete forms extending visibly beyond the fence line he had maintained for 8 years, and a note at the bottom of the last page underlined once that told whoever found the box exactly where to look next. State Archives, Salem, batch 1978 to 1983. If they have not destroyed it, the original filed survey is there. The county copy can be altered by a determined official. The state copy requires a court order to touch. Burke would have known this. He would have hoped no one ever looked that far. Harold had ended the letter with a single line that was not addressed to Dorothy or to any specific person, but which had the quality of something said aloud in an empty room because the speaker needed to hear it, even if no one else did. I was right. I am putting this here because being right should count for something, even if it only counts after I am gone. Dorothy folded the letter and held it in both hands and sat in Harold Finch's dining room for a long time without moving. Then she picked up the folded documents and began to go through them one by one. Near the bottom of the stack, she found something that Harold had not put there. She knew this immediately because the paper was different, bright white, where everything else was amber, the printing sharp, where everything else was faded. It was a single sheet, a printout from what appeared to be a digital records database dated 14 months ago. Someone had accessed a property transfer database, searched for Meridian Plaza, and printed the ownership history. The building had passed through 3 owners between 1982 and 2019. Then in March of 2019, it had been acquired by a Portland-based investment entity. The name of that entity was Hargrove Capital LLC. Dorothy read the name twice. She set the page down. She picked it up again because her mind was performing the particular function minds perform when they encounter something that cannot be correct: the automatic recheck, the rereading, the search for a different interpretation. There was no different interpretation. She took out her phone and typed the name into the search bar. The website came up immediately. Clean design, professional photography, the careful language of people who manage significant money. The listed principals included a managing director whose name she had been writing on forms and documents in envelopes and birthday cards for 42 years. Richard A. Hargrove. She sat with this for a long time without moving. Outside, a car passed on Alderman Street. Somewhere 2 houses down, a dog was conducting its morning assessment of the neighborhood. The coffee she had not yet made was not there to help her. What she was feeling was not betrayal, because betrayal requires surprise, and she was not surprised. What she was feeling was something more specific and in some ways more disturbing, which was the recognition of a pattern. Richard had structured his financial interests carefully over many years, always keeping the important assets at one remove from shared ownership, always maintaining the precise paperwork that would matter when the paperwork mattered. He had done this with the house. He had done this with the shop. And he had done this with a $14 million commercial property that was sitting on land that had belonged to an old man who had hidden the proof of it under his dining room floor. She did not know yet whether Richard had known about Harold. She did not know whether the man who had printed this page and placed it in the box was Harold's ally or his enemy, or simply someone who had found the box and decided to leave a trail for whoever came next. What she knew was that the trail existed, and she was the one who had found it. She went next door and knocked. Carolyn Marsh opened the door in a canvas work jacket, clearly on her way somewhere. She looked at Dorothy at the folder of papers Dorothy was holding and made the immediate recalculation of someone whose morning has just changed shape. "You opened it," Carolyn said. You knew about the box. I knew Harold hid something. He told me once, years before he disappeared, that he had put the truth somewhere it would keep. I didn't know where. I looked after he was gone. Not well enough, apparently. Dorothy handed her the letter. Carolyn read it standing in her doorway. She read slowly with the concentration of someone reading something they have been waiting a long time to read. When she finished, she handed it back. Her face had done something that was not quite grief and not quite satisfaction, but held pieces of both. He wasn't confused, Carolyn said. He was right. The whole time he was right and nobody listened. Meridian Plaza was sold in 2019, Dorothy said, to a company called Hargrove Capital. Carolyn looked at her steadily. Hargrove is your name? It is. Is that a coincidence? No. They stood in silence for a moment, the morning air moving between them. I watched those people come and go for 22 years, Carolyn said finally. Every one of them who stood in that yard and then left. I used to think it was the house that drove them away, something about the place itself. But now I think it was just that none of them needed it enough to stay. She looked at Dorothy. You needed it. I still need it, Dorothy said. And I need to know if you'll tell what you know about Harold Finch to whoever asks officially. Carolyn picked up her bag from beside the door. I've been waiting 22 years for someone to ask officially, she said. You tell me when. The lawyer's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Portland with a view of the river that probably cost a meaningful portion of the monthly overhead. Sandra Oaks was 52, tailored with a particular brand of warmth that lawyers who charge $400 an hour have cultivated specifically for initial consultations, warm enough to feel genuine, measured enough to be retracted without explanation. Dorothy laid the documents on the conference table and walked through them in order. The letter, the original survey, copies the correspondence, the photograph, and the printout showing the 2019 sale to Hargrove Capital. She spoke for 15 minutes without interruption, which she had prepared for because she had learned that if you stop to check whether the person is following you, you give them space to start managing the conversation. Sandra asked 3 questions. They were good questions. Dorothy answered them. Then Sandra placed both palms flat on the conference table, which Dorothy had noticed was the gesture she used before delivering a conclusion she had already reached. I understand what you're presenting, Sandra said, but I want to be honest with you. This is a boundary dispute rooted in records from 1982, built on documents from a man who disappeared over 30 years ago, without continuous chain of custody, without notarized verification against a property that has changed hands multiple times and has been commercially developed. Courts are not patient with historical land claims of this type without substantially more current evidence. I haven't asked about the current evidence yet, Dorothy said. I'm asking whether you'll take the case. Sandra looked at the documents again. A specific kind of stillness had come into her face, the stillness of someone who has found something they did not expect and is deciding how to respond to it. Before I answer that, she said, I need to ask you something. Are you aware that Hargrove Capital is a client of this firm? Dorothy looked at her. Are they? They are. Which means I have a conflict that prevents me from taking this case. I apologize. I should have confirmed that before we began. Should you have, Dorothy said. She gathered the documents back into the folder with deliberate care, taking her time, and Sandra Oaks sat across from her and did not say anything else. When Dorothy stood, she said thank you in a tone that communicated exactly how little the thank you meant, and she took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the Portland afternoon. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building and looked up at the 14th floor for a long moment. Sandra Oaks had not been surprised by the case. She had been surprised by the specific name on the 2019 transfer document, and she had managed the surprise with great professionalism. But Dorothy had spent a career evaluating things, and she knew the difference between a lawyer who didn't think a case was strong and a lawyer who knew the case was strong and did not want to be near it. That was information. Dorothy filed it and walked to the bus stop. The county records office on Southeast Division was a low building with fluorescent lighting and low ceilings and carpet, the color of a decision no one particularly wanted to make. Dorothy took a number and waited, and when her number was called, she approached the counter and spoke to a man whose nameplate said Frank DeLuca. Frank DeLuca was 55 with the face of a man who had spent several decades saying no to requests he had the power to accommodate and had made a philosophy of it. He looked at Dorothy's written request for access to pre-1990 boundary survey documents for the Alderman Street area and shook his head before he had finished reading it. Records prior to 1990 are in digitization backlog, he said. No direct access. How long has that backlog been in progress? We don't have a projected completion date. I'd like to submit a formal written request under the Oregon Public Records Law, Dorothy said. Frank looked at her with the expression of someone who has just realized the person across the counter is more prepared than they appeared. That would be the AR-7 form, he said. Where can I get it? He went to retrieve it with a particular quality of movement that communicated his feelings about the errand without saying anything. Dorothy filled out the form at the counter slowly and completely, noting in the comments section that she was requesting records related to a boundary determination and citing the relevant statutory provision for a 5-business-day response. She handed it back to Frank DeLuca with a smile he did not return. He looked at the completed form for a moment, then at Dorothy with the reassessing expression of a man who expected a first visit and is now calculating whether there will be more. There would be more. She could see him reaching that conclusion and not being pleased by it. On the 5th business day, a response arrived at 14 Alderman Street in a county envelope. She had given the Alderman Street address with the particular intention of establishing a documented paper trail that connected her to the property officially. Inside a single form stating that record AR-2291-B, the 1978 boundary survey for the Alderman Street corridor, was not present in the county's current records inventory. She read that twice. Then she looked at the second piece of paper that had been folded behind the official form. Smaller, no letterhead, no signature written in pencil. State Archives, Salem, batch 1978 to 1983. Ask in person, do not call ahead. Someone in Frank DeLuca's office had sent her the official denial that the office was required to send. And then someone, perhaps the same person or perhaps a different one, had folded a handwritten note behind it and sealed the envelope and sent it anyway. There were people inside every system who knew what was true and could not say it loudly, but could not stay entirely silent either. Dorothy thought about that for a while. Then she looked up the bus schedule to Salem. Dorothy took the bus to Salem the following Tuesday, a 2.5-hour ride through the gray winter landscape of the Willamette Valley with Harold's documents in a canvas bag on her lap and the handwritten note folded in her coat pocket. She had not told anyone where she was going. Not Patricia, not Carolyn. She was not yet certain what she would find, and she had learned over the past weeks to be careful about raising expectations, including her own, before there was something solid enough to stand on. The Oregon State Archives on Court Street was a place that took its work seriously, and you could feel it from the moment you walked in. The staff moved with the deliberate efficiency of people who understand that what they are keeping matters, that the difference between a record that survives and one that disappears can sometimes mean the difference between justice and its absence. Dorothy signed in, stated her research purpose, and was directed to the reading room. She had been working through a preliminary index for perhaps 40 minutes, cross-referencing the batch numbers Harold had mentioned against the available catalog, when the man sitting 2 tables away leaned slightly in her direction and said without looking up from his own documents, "That survey form you're holding, the corner stamp, is that the 1978 standard issue?" Dorothy looked at the corner of the document. "It says 1978, yes." The man looked up. He was perhaps 34, with the kind of restless focus that belongs to people who think faster than they can sit still for. He had a substantial stack of documents on his side of the table and the particular expression of someone who is 3/4 of the way through something complicated and is finding it more interesting the further in he gets. His name was Nathan Briggs. He was an attorney. He explained working on a property dispute that involved survey records from the same general period she was researching. He had left a large firm 14 months ago and opened his own practice, and when she asked why he had left, he said it without drama or performance, the way people describe things they have made their peace with. He had been asked to suppress evidence in a case involving a boundary adjustment that had benefited a development client. He had done it. He had not slept well for 6 months afterward. One morning he had written his resignation letter and felt for the first time in those 6 months like the person he had gone to law school to become. He listened to Dorothy's case with the attention of someone who is not performing interest, but actually has it. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for the documents until she offered them. When he finished reading Harold's letter, he set it down on the table with the care of someone handling something that has weight beyond its physical dimensions. He asked 3 questions. They were precise and practical. The questions of a person assembling a structure rather than exploring a landscape. When she finished answering, he was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cloud moved and the reading room brightened slightly, the light shifting across the old documents on the table between them. Do you know the current assessed value of Meridian Plaza, he asked. I looked it up, Dorothy said. 14 million approximately. The 40-foot strip under the parking structure is not incidental to that valuation, Nathan said. Without that parking structure, the building doesn't meet city commercial code for the square footage it's permitted. Remove the legal basis for the parking, and you create a material defect in a $14 million asset. He looked at her steadily. And there is a second layer here. I would need to verify it, but if there was a more recent county record amendment touching that boundary one made without proper judicial authorization, then the people who acquired the property in 2019 either knew about the underlying problem or failed to catch it. Either way, that is a different and considerably more serious kind of liability. Dorothy looked at him. Are you telling me what I have, or are you asking to be part of getting it? He held her gaze. Both. You left a firm rather than bury something like this once before, she said. Yes, and now you're willing to take this. I have been looking for a way to do the thing I should have done the first time, he said. I don't think I'm going to find a cleaner version of that opportunity than this one. They shook hands across the archive table in the quiet reading room, with Harold Finch's 40-year-old survey documents spread between them. There was no contract yet. There was no office arrangement yet. There was just two people who had each in their own way decided that the thing which had been buried deserved to come up. What Nathan found in the Salem batch over the following 2 weeks confirmed everything Harold had suspected and added something Harold had not lived to know. The 1978 boundary survey was intact exactly as Harold had described it, showing the southern property line of 14 Alderman Street in unmistakable terms. And alongside it, Nathan located the 1982 county amendment bearing Thomas Burke's signature submitted without any accompanying court order, which was a procedural violation serious enough to render the amendment legally void under Oregon statute. Nathan called Dorothy on a Tuesday evening to tell her about the Salem findings. He was brief and precise the way he was when something mattered more than his words could fully carry. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, Harold was right about all of it. Not as a question, as a statement being placed on record, even if the only record was a phone call between two people in separate rooms. But the second discovery was the one that changed the stakes entirely. In more recent county filings, Nathan found evidence of a second boundary amendment dated 2018, 1 year before Hargrove Capital acquired Meridian Plaza. This amendment had also been processed without documented judicial authorization. The employee who had signed it had left county service 6 months later and was now on the payroll of a Hargrove Capital subsidiary. Nathan called Dorothy again when he found this. His voice had a different quality, the second time quieter and more careful, the voice of someone who has found more than they expected and is being deliberate about how they handle it. This changes the nature of the case, he said. The 1982 violation was old, defensible as a historical administrative error, even if it wasn't. But the 2018 amendment was made by someone who then went to work for Hargrove Capital. That is a thread that leads somewhere, and when we pull it in court, the opposing counsel will know exactly where it leads. Dorothy thought about this. Did Richard know about the 1982 problem before he bought the property? That is the question a judge will want answered, Nathan said. And it is the question that makes a settlement significantly more attractive to the other side than going to trial. The pattern was not subtle once you knew to look for it. Someone had tried to clean the title before the sale. They had done it without enough care in the way that people are careless when they are confident no one is watching closely enough to notice. Evelyn Cross called on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after Salem. Dorothy did not recognize the number. My name is Evelyn Cross, the woman said. Harold Finch was my grandfather. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people making the same adjustment at the same time. Evelyn was 45. She had known for most of her adult life that her grandfather had hidden something in the house on Alderman Street. He had told her once when she was perhaps 12 that he had put the truth somewhere safe, and she had thought of it in the way children think of things adults tell them as information that will make sense later. By the time later arrived, Harold was gone and the house was in legal limbo, and Evelyn had spent years trying to establish her rights to the property through probate channels that kept colliding with the unresolved boundary dispute that kept the title clouded in a way that made every attorney she consulted look tired before she finished explaining. "I'm not calling to claim the house," she said. "You bought it. You found what he hid. That means something." "What do you want?" Dorothy asked, not unkindly, directly. "I want a court to acknowledge that he was right, in writing, on the record, not a settlement that disappears into a file. I want his name on the document that says the boundary was wrong from the beginning." Nathan's caution when Dorothy told him was genuine and measured. If Evelyn entered the case as a formal claimant, the opposing counsel would have more procedural angles to work with, more reasons to extend the timeline, more complexity to introduce. It was a real consideration. It was not Dorothy decided the deciding consideration. She sat with it a call for an evening before responding. She thought about what Nathan had said regarding the procedural complications of a second claimant. She thought about it seriously because Nathan's concern was legitimate, and she had learned to take legitimate concerns seriously rather than dismiss them in favor of what she wanted to do. Then she thought about a man writing his initials into his own floor with a ruler, about a letter addressed to a stranger he would never meet, about the specific nature of wanting your name on a corrected record rather than a check. She understood that kind of wanting. It was not complicated. She called Evelyn back the following morning. "You provide a sworn statement about your grandfather's identity, your relationship to him, and the history of the property as you know it," Dorothy said. "Nathan leads the case. When it resolves, we discuss compensation from whatever settlement or judgment results. And Harold Finch's name goes on the corrected record. That is not negotiable." "That's all I wanted," Evelyn said. There was a pause on the line, and then Evelyn said something that Dorothy did not expect. "Can I ask you something? Why did you stay in that house? You didn't know what was there. You had no particular reason to." Dorothy thought about this honestly. "I was out of reasons not to," she said, "and sometimes that's enough to begin with." "He would have understood that," Evelyn said. "He stayed in that house for years after most people would have left. Not because he couldn't go anywhere else, because leaving felt like agreeing that he had been wrong to believe it was his." Dorothy did not say anything because there was nothing useful to add to that. 3 days after Nathan filed the case at the Multnomah County Courthouse, his phone rang. He called Dorothy immediately after. A man named Marcus Webb, representing Hargrove Capital, had contacted Nathan to suggest an informal conversation before the matter proceeded further. The opening offer, delivered in the careful language of people who do not want to appear to be making an offer, was $80,000 to withdraw the complaint. Nathan had declined and reported the contact to the court clerk as a matter of record. "He called you directly," Dorothy said. "Yes. Before you'd had a chance to fully develop the public record." "Yes?" She thought about this. "They've already looked at what we filed, and they know we're stronger than they hoped." "That is what $80,000 before discovery means," Nathan said. "It means they ran the numbers and they don't like what they found." That night, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table in 14 Alderman Street with a cup of tea that had gone cold and Harold Finch's letter in front of her. She had read it many times by now. She did not read it again. She looked at it and thought about a man who had been careful enough to hide the truth and patient enough to believe it would eventually matter to someone, and she thought that if he had been able to see this particular moment, the cold tea in the kitchen that was slowly becoming a real kitchen, and the case that was moving through a courthouse 14 blocks away, he might have found something in it that resembled the satisfaction of being at last taken seriously. Then a week after the first call from Marcus Webb, a plain white envelope appeared in the mailbox at 14 Alderman Street. No return address, typed text printed and cut from a sheet. 4 words, "Back away. You don't understand what you're touching." Dorothy photographed the envelope before she touched it, holding the mailbox open with her elbow and using both hands to keep the phone steady. She called Nathan and read him the message and described the envelope. He drove over within the hour and collected it in a clear plastic sleeve and drove it to the Portland Police Bureau's non-emergency intake office, where he filed a report and submitted it as evidence of potential witness intimidation in connection with an active civil filing. 2 days later, Nathan called. The postmark traced to a branch post office on Nido Parkway. The branch had a security camera covering the outgoing mail drop. The camera had recorded a man in a dark coat and a hat dropping the envelope at 7:22 in the morning. His face was not clearly visible. The vehicle he returned to was visible. The plate was registered to a fleet management company that held a service contract with, among other clients, Hargrove Capital. Dorothy was standing at the kitchen sink when Nathan told her this. She was looking out the window at the strip of yard that ran along the southern edge of the property toward the wall of Meridian Plaza, visible beyond the back fence. They sent a message from a vehicle they could be connected to, she said. People make mistakes when they're frightened, Nathan said. Marcus Webb called again this morning, Nathan added. He wants to discuss what he called a serious resolution. He said the number would be different. Dorothy looked at the wall of Meridian Plaza in the afternoon light. 40 years ago, Harold Finch had stood somewhere near here and watched the concrete go in and known that something was being taken from him and been unable to stop it. He had done the only thing he could do. He had kept the truth and hidden it carefully and trusted that eventually the right person would find it. She thought about Richard, not the Richard of the attorney's office, the one with the prepared documents and the measured delivery. She thought about the Richard who had called her at Motel 6 in the first week before she had found the box, before any of this had started. That call had been about the paperwork being complete, the voicemail she had listened to once and deleted. His voice in that message had the tone of a man closing an account. Efficient, final, already looking forward. She wondered what he would sound like when he found out about this. Tell him we'll discuss a resolution, she said. Tell him we want a number that reflects the actual situation. Not a number that reflects what they hoped we didn't know. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The actual situation, Nathan said, and she could hear in his voice that he understood precisely what she meant, has become significantly more complicated for them in the last 2 weeks. I know, Dorothy said. That's the point. The morning of the preliminary hearing, Dorothy woke before 5 and lay still in the dark for a while listening to the house. It had a different sound now than it had on that first night 8 months ago. The gaps around the window frames had been sealed. The west wall had been re-insulated. The floors still creaked in certain places, and she had stopped trying to remember which places and had simply learned them the way you learn the particular geography of a place you intend to stay in. The house was not finished. It might never be entirely finished because old houses are not things you complete so much as things you enter into a long conversation with. But it was warm. It was solid. And it was hers in a way that no document had been required to confirm, because she had been here every morning for 8 months, and that was its own kind of title. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the folder Nathan had given her the day before, a summary of the case as it stood going into the hearing. She did not read it. She had read it 3 times already, and she knew it well enough that reading it again would only be a way of managing her nerves. And she had decided some weeks ago that managing her nerves was less useful than simply having them and continuing anyway. She thought instead about the phone call she had received 2 nights before. Not from Nathan, not from Evelyn, from Richard. She had looked at his name on the screen for 3 full rings, which is a long time when you are deciding something. Then she had answered. His voice was not the boardroom voice. It was not the efficient closing of accounts voice from the early voicemail either. It was something she recognized from further back, from the years before the years when things had been whatever they had been. The voice of a man who was trying to find a register that would work and was not certain which one to use. Dorothy, he said, just her name, using the full version which he only used when the situation had weight. Richard, I need you to understand what you're doing. A pause. This isn't only about me. There are people whose livelihoods depend on Meridian's operating status. Staff, tenants. The kind of disruption you're creating doesn't land only on the people at the top. She had heard this argument, or versions of it, from Marcus Webb's letters and from the general temperature of the opposing counsel's filings. It was not an argument without merit. It was also not the argument of a man who had suddenly developed concern for his tenants. It was the argument of a man running out of other arguments and reaching for the most sympathetic one left. When you restructured the retirement accounts, Dorothy said, did you think about the people whose livelihoods depended on my shop? The woman who had worked there for 11 years. She lost her position when you dissolved the partnership structure. He did not answer that. I'm not doing this to hurt people, Richard. I'm doing it because a man named Harold Finch was right, and nobody let him be right while he was alive to know it. And because the land under that building was never legally transferred in the first place, and that is a fact, and facts don't stop being facts because they're inconvenient. You could walk away with a number that would set you up for the rest of your life, he said. Webb is authorized to go significantly higher than the initial conversation suggested. I know, she said. Nathan told me. Then why are you still pushing this to a hearing? She thought about how to say the next part because it mattered that it be accurate and not theatrical. Because a hearing creates a public record. A settlement in a back room creates a check that the other side spends the next decade trying to characterize as a nuisance payment. I want a judge in a courtroom to look at Harold Finch's survey documents and say out loud in a proceeding that gets filed and indexed and cannot be altered that those documents are legitimate. That is worth more than whatever number Webb has in his pocket. There was a silence that lasted long enough that she thought he might have set the phone down. "You've changed," Richard said finally. "No," she said. "I've been paying attention." She had ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a while with her hands flat on the surface, not with the trembling she might have expected at some earlier point in this process, but with the particular stillness of someone who has said the true thing and is sitting in the aftermath of having said it. It did not feel triumphant. It felt accurate. There was a kind of satisfaction and accuracy that she was coming to recognize as its own distinct thing, separate from winning, separate from being heard, simply the satisfaction of having said what was precisely true in the moment it needed to be said. The Multnomah County Courthouse on Southwest 4th Avenue had the gray solidity of a building that had seen a great deal of human difficulty and was neither impressed nor unsympathetic. Dorothy arrived 40 minutes early. Nathan was already there in the corridor outside the assigned courtroom with Sandra Oakes beside him. Sandra had come to Nathan 6 weeks after the case was filed, not to Dorothy. She had explained that her relationship with Hargrove Capital had ended, that she had become aware of information during her prior representation that she was not at liberty to disclose, but which had led her to conclude that she had a professional obligation to make herself available if her knowledge of certain background facts could be useful. Nathan had listened to her for an hour and then called Dorothy. Dorothy had said if Nathan wanted her, she had no objection. But she had also said clearly and without softening it that she understood Sandra's motivations to include both genuine reconsideration and professional self-protection, and that she was not interested in pretending otherwise. Sandra had heard this apparently without taking offense, which had raised Dorothy's estimation of her somewhat. In the corridor now, Sandra handed Dorothy a coffee without being asked and said, "Webb has 2 associates with him in addition to his lead partner. 4 attorneys total." "How many do we have?" Dorothy asked. "2," Nathan said, "but ours actually read the file." Evelyn Cross arrived 7 minutes before the scheduled time in a gray coat Dorothy had not seen before, her face composed in the particular way of people who have been preparing for something for a long time and are surprised now that it is here by how calm they feel. She embraced Dorothy briefly, the embrace of 2 people who have not known each other long but have been through enough together to have skipped several stages of acquaintance. "How are you feeling?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Like someone who has been carrying something heavy and is about to set it down in front of people who are required to look at it," Dorothy said. Evelyn nodded. "That's exactly right," she said. She reached into her bag and took out a small photograph and held it for a moment before offering it to Dorothy. It was a man in his 50s standing in a yard Dorothy recognized immediately, the same yard she had spent 8 months reclaiming. He was holding a tomato plant with the particular pride of someone who had grown something from seed. He had a narrow face and the careful eyes of a man who paid attention to things. "I thought he should be here somehow," Evelyn said, "even if it's just a photograph in a coat pocket." Dorothy looked at the photograph for a long moment. Harold Finch standing in the yard of the house he had loved and fought for and ultimately lost, not knowing that someone would eventually find what he had left behind and bring it to a place like this. She handed the photograph back. "Keep it with you," she said. "He earned a seat in that room." Evelyn put the photograph back in her pocket, and they walked together toward the courtroom door. The courtroom was not large. It was a preliminary hearing, not a trial, and the gallery held only a handful of people, 2 of whom Dorothy did not recognize and suspected were observers from the development community, given the way they held very still and took no notes. At the plaintiff's table, Dorothy sat between Nathan on her left and Sandra on her right, with Evelyn directly behind her. Across the room, Marcus Webb arranged his materials with the unhurried precision of a man who intended to convey that the next few hours were a minor inconvenience in an otherwise fully controlled situation. Dorothy looked at him once. He did not look back. The judge was a woman named Harriet Soames, who had the reputation Nathan had told her of running her courtroom with extreme patience for substance and extreme impatience for theater. She entered settled, looked at both tables, and said that she had reviewed the preliminary filings and had some questions before they proceeded. Her first question was for Nathan about the chain of custody for the documents recovered from the property. Her second question was for both sides about the 2018 County Record Amendment and whether either party was prepared to speak to the legal authorization for that amendment. Her third question was for Marcus Webb, specifically about why the fleet vehicle connected to the intimidation letter had not been addressed in any of Hargrove Capital's responsive filings. Webb answered the third question with the careful language of a man explaining that his client had no knowledge of the incident and that the vehicle connection was circumstantial, and that they were, of course, fully committed to cooperating with any law enforcement inquiry. Judge Soames looked at him for a moment after he finished. "I'm sure they are," she said and moved on. Nathan presented the core of the case in 40 minutes. The 1978 survey authenticated by independent forensic analysis of the paper and ink. Harold Finch's correspondence with the county demonstrating his awareness of and objection to the boundary violation at the time it occurred. The 1982 amendment signed by Thomas Burke without any accompanying court order. The 2018 amendment made by a man who was now a salaried employee of a Hargrove Capital subsidiary, also without documented judicial authorization. He placed each document before the judge in sequence, and the sequence had a cumulative weight that Dorothy could feel in the room, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply the weight of things that had been true for 40 years and were now being allowed to be true in a place where truth had standing. Webb's objections were procedurally competent and landed without force. The chain of custody argument had been anticipated. Nathan had the forensic report. The argument that historical inequities could not retroactively affect current legitimate ownership interests was more substantive, and Judge Soames engaged with it for several minutes, asking. Nathan pointed questions about precedent and the limits of title reformation questions. He answered with the focused precision of someone who had spent 2 months reading case law at 4 hours of sleep a night. At 11:47, Judge Soames called a recess. In the corridor, Webb approached Nathan and Dorothy with the particular walk of a man who has recalculated and is now operating from a different set of numbers. He did not have the two associates with him. He had come alone, which Dorothy recognized as a deliberate choice. "My client is prepared to discuss resolution today," he said. "Given what's been presented this morning, I think we can move to a number that reflects the realistic exposure here." "What number?" Nathan said. $340,000. Full transfer of the Alderman Street property to your client in clear title. A public filing correcting the county and state boundary records to reflect the 1978 survey. No admission of liability." Dorothy looked at Nathan. He looked at her. The number was real. The record correction was real. The clean title was what she had needed from the beginning. The corrected filing names Harold Walter Finch as the original titled holder of the disputed parcel, Dorothy said, by name in the public record. Webb's expression moved through something brief and then settled back into professional composure. "I'll need to confirm that specific language with my client." "You have until 2 o'clock, Dorothy said, "when the hearing resumes." Webb walked back toward his associates. Nathan leaned slightly toward Dorothy and said quietly, "340 is more than I projected." "I know. The name condition is the one that'll give them pause." "I know that too," she said. "It's also the condition that's not negotiable." She went to find Evelyn, who was standing near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the city. Portland spread south and west below them, the river catching what gray light the November sky offered. Dorothy stood beside her without speaking for a moment. "How did it feel?" Evelyn asked. "In there?" Dorothy considered the question honestly. "Like watching something that's been held underwater for a long time finally come to the surface," she said. "Not dramatic, just correct." Evelyn nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. Her grandfather had lived in the city that had ignored him for the last years of his life and the decades after. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "He would have liked that you stayed." At 1:58, Webb delivered the confirmation. The name condition was accepted. The language would read, "The corrected boundary record acknowledges Harold Walter Finch as the original titled holder of the parcel as described in the 1978 county survey, and that the 1982 and 2018 amendments to said boundary were procedurally deficient and are hereby voided." It would be filed at the county level and transmitted to the state archives in Salem, where it would be placed in the same batch that contained the original 1978 survey that Harold had trusted to the system and the system had just barely preserved. The settlement documents were prepared by both legal teams over the following 3 hours in a conference room that Multnomah County made available for precisely this kind of resolution. Dorothy read every page, not because she did not trust Nathan, because she had learned at considerable cost that reading the pages in front of you before you sign them is a practice worth maintaining for the rest of your life. She asked two questions, both of which Nathan answered, and one which Sandra answered with the particular detail of someone who had helped draft similar agreements from the other side, and therefore knew exactly which clauses carried weight and which were furniture. At 4:45 in the afternoon, Dorothy signed her name at the bottom of the final page. Dorothea Hargrove. She did not rush it. She wrote each letter with the care of someone who understood that this particular signature was not the end of something, but the formal beginning of something that had already been underway for 8 months. The something that had started on a floor in the dark with a toothbrush in a cold water tap in a decision so small it barely qualified as a decision and yet had somehow been the first one. Nathan put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Sandra shook her hand. Evelyn, sitting across the table, looked at her with an expression that Dorothy found difficult to categorize and eventually decided did not need to be categorized. Some things did not need to fit into a category. They only needed to be received. What came after the settlement was quieter than Dorothy had expected, and she had expected it to be quiet. There was no announcement, no press release. The corrected boundary filing went into the county system and then into the state system with the bureaucratic efficiency of documents that have been processed by people performing a function, and within 6 weeks it was simply a matter of record that the disputed parcel had always belonged to 14 Alderman Street and that Harold Walter Finch had been right. The $340,000 arrived in the account Nathan had set up for the purpose on a Thursday morning in March, and Dorothy looked at the balance and felt something she identified after a moment as perspective. It was not a life-changing amount in the way that phrase is usually meant. It would not eliminate the need to think about money for the rest of her days. But it was real and it was hers, and it had come from the thing she had stayed to find, and there was a quality to money earned that way that was entirely different from any other kind. She paid Nathan, she paid Sandra the consulting fee they had agreed on. She paid for the electrical work at the house still needed, and the window on the north side that had cracked during February, and the water heater that had been failing since November. She set aside what was needed and thought carefully about what was left. She called Evelyn, and they met for lunch on a Thursday in April at a Vietnamese restaurant on Northeast Broadway, where the food was serious and the room was loud enough for a private conversation. "I want to establish something," Dorothy said, "a small endowment through the Oregon Historical Society for the preservation of records related to land disputes in Portland from the 1970s and 1980s. Cases like your grandfather's, where the evidence existed, but no one with resources was willing to pursue it." Evelyn looked at her across the table. In his name, the Harold W. Finch Records Preservation Fund. It won't be large enough to change the world, but it will be large enough to matter to someone who needs a document and can't afford to find it. Evelyn set down her chopsticks. She looked at the table for a moment and then looked up, and Dorothy saw that she was working to keep her face composed in the way people work when something has landed precisely where they were hoping it would land. "He spent 40 years trying to get someone to look at a document," Evelyn said. "I know. And now there's going to be money specifically for helping people find documents." "Yes." Evelyn picked up her chopsticks again. "He would have made a comment about that being too neat," she said. "He had no patience for things that seemed too perfectly arranged. He always said real justice was messier." A pause. "But I think he would have been pleased." Nathan sent a card in May, a real card, handwritten, not an email. He had a client who had come to him with a boundary dispute in Gresham. He wrote a retired school teacher named Robert Okafor, who was trying to recover a strip of land that a neighboring commercial developer had absorbed during a 2016 expansion. Nathan had agreed to take the case at a reduced rate. He thought Dorothy should know. She read the card twice and put it in the kitchen drawer next to Harold's letter. Walter Pruitt's office on Burnside was closed by the time Dorothy walked past it in late April, the listings removed from the window and a for lease sign on the door. She had thought about Walter often in the months since the settlement, about the specific deliberateness of a man who had held a property in disputed status for 30 years, who had kept the listing priced at $3 and placed it in a window on a street that a certain kind of person walked down on a certain kind of afternoon, who had said not yet, with the particular emphasis of someone managing a sequence he had been managing for a very long time. A week after she noticed the closed office, a plain envelope arrived at 14 Alderman Street. Inside, no letter. Only a single document, a photocopied real estate holding agreement dated September 1991, 3 months after Harold Finch disappeared. The agreement showed that a Walter R. Pruitt, acting as an independent property custodian, had accepted responsibility for maintaining the legal status of 14 Alderman Street in unresolved dispute status, with a mandate to prevent sale development or clear title transfer until the underlying boundary dispute could be properly adjudicated. The mandate had been maintained for 32 years. Dorothy held the document for a long time. She thought about a man sitting in a small office on Burnside for 3 decades, keeping a listing in his window at $3, waiting for someone to ask the right question, not publicizing it, not pursuing it himself because he was not Harold and the story was not his to finish, just maintaining the conditions under which the truth could eventually be found by whoever arrived with enough reason to stay. She thought about him packing up that office, removing the listings from the window one by one, and sending this document without a note because no note was necessary. She placed it in the drawer next to Harold's letter and Nathan's card. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after thinking about Walter Pruitt. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she walked into his office, not like a customer, but like an answer. She thought about the $3, the minimum legally valid amount, chosen not for its symbolic resonance, but for its precise legal function, the lowest possible price that would constitute a real transaction and begin the clock on a proper transfer. He had known the law the way you know it when you have been living alongside a specific legal problem for 30 years. He had not stumbled into the right price. He had engineered it. And he had chosen to do all of this without telling anyone, without credit, without the acknowledgement that would have been available to him if he had made the story about himself. He had found Harold's cause after Harold disappeared and had decided it was worth protecting until someone came along who could carry it further. And then when the someone arrived and the carrying was done, he had closed his office and sent a document and disappeared as quietly as Harold had, though with considerably more intention behind the disappearing. Dorothy found herself thinking that there were more people like Walter Pruitt in the world than you generally assume, people who took on the maintenance of things that needed maintaining with no expectation of recognition. They were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves. You tended to find out about them only afterward in a plain envelope with no note inside because they had decided the document said everything that needed saying. The housewarming was Carolyn's idea, which surprised Dorothy because Carolyn was not a woman who typically proposed gatherings. She came over one morning in May with the suggestion delivered in her usual direct manner, which was that Dorothy had been living in that house for 8 months and fixing it and fighting for it, and now that the fight was done and the house was what it was, it seemed like someone ought to acknowledge that out loud in the presence of other people. And if Dorothy wasn't going to organize it, then Carolyn would. Dorothy said that Carolyn could organize it if she wanted. The gathering on a Saturday in June was small, 15 people at most in the backyard and kitchen of 14 Alderman Street. Carolyn brought food and directed people where to stand with the efficiency of someone who had decided that if she was running this event, it was going to be run properly. Nathan came with his wife. Evelyn came and stood for a long time in the dining room, the room where the box had been, and Dorothy left her there without interruption. 2 neighbors from further down Alderman Street came, people Dorothy had exchanged only practical words with, but who arrived with wine and the particular goodwill of people who had watched something happen on their street and were glad it had happened the way it had. At some point in the evening, Dorothy found herself standing at the back fence looking south toward the wall of Meridian Plaza, which was still there, which would continue to be there, operating legally on land that now had the correct boundary documentation attached to it in 2 separate government archives. The building had not been demolished. The tenants had not been displaced. The parking structure remained. What had changed was the record, and the record was not nothing. The record was, in many ways, the whole point. She thought about something Nathan had said during one of their early meetings in the Salem archives, when she had asked him what winning actually looked like in a case like this. He had been quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was being honest rather than strategic. Then he had said that in land disputes rooted in old administrative fraud, winning rarely looked like demolition or restitution in the dramatic sense. It looked like correction. The record said one thing for 40 years. Now it said something different. The building stayed. The people in it went about their lives. But the official account of how it came to be there, the story that the government kept about the shape of this block of Portland, was no longer a lie. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. She had thought about that a lot in the months since. about the difference between correction and destruction, about choosing to fix the record rather than burn down the building. Harold had not wanted Meridian Plaza demolished. He had wanted to be right. Those were different things, and understanding the difference was she had come to believe most of the work of being a person who could actually make something better rather than only make something stop. She heard Carolyn come to stand beside her. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd walked past that window?" Carolyn said. "Sometimes. And I think someone else would have eventually found Harold's box. Maybe not for another 20 years, maybe not for 50, but it would have been found." She paused. "The thing about hiding the truth carefully is that it doesn't disappear. It just waits." Carolyn was quiet for a moment. Behind them, the sound of the gathering voices and someone laughing at something and the scrape of a chair on the back porch. "He left that letter for whoever finally stayed," Carolyn said. "And you stayed." "I had nowhere else to go," Dorothy said. And then, because that was true but not complete, she added, "And then I did have somewhere else to go and I stayed anyway." Carolyn nodded, once the nod of a woman who understood the difference between those two sentences and knew they did not need elaboration. Later, after everyone had gone and she had washed the glasses and stacked them on the shelf she had installed herself in, Dorothy turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment in the room that had been cold and broken and lit only by a flashlight on the first night, and was now warm and repaired and quiet in the way of a place that has been occupied long enough to take on the particular character of its occupant. She went to the drawer and took out Harold's letter. She did not read it. She knew it by heart by now, every sentence, every careful word, the handwriting she had come to recognize as well as her own. She held it in both hands in the dark, this letter that had waited in a box under a floor for 34 years. This letter written by a man who knew he was writing past everyone who would come and leave until finally he reached the one who wouldn't. She thought about what had been taken from her: the house on Ridgemont, the shop, the years of assumption that had turned out to be years of not looking closely enough. She thought about Richard's voice on the phone 2 nights before the hearing, not the efficient voice of the attorney's office, but the reaching voice, the voice of a man who had run out of the kind of certainty he had always depended on and was not sure what came next. She had not argued with him because she did not think it was worth arguing, but the truth was that she had not changed in the way he meant. She had not become harder or colder or more strategic. She had simply become more fully herself without the particular accommodation that comes from spending 42 years adjusting your understanding of things to match someone else's version of what was real. She put the letter back in the drawer. She stood at the window of the kitchen and looked out at Alderman Street, at the yellow streetlight and the dark houses and the particular quiet of a residential street at 10 on a Saturday night. A quiet that was not empty, but full of people inside their lit windows and people already asleep, and the sounds that neighborhoods make when no one is performing for anyone. Her kitchen window looked out onto this. Her fence ran along this street. Her housewarming had happened tonight in the yard behind her, and the voices of the people who came had settled into the walls the way voices settle, becoming part of the history of the place in the small and unrecorded way that most history actually happens. 42 years she had lived inside a version of her life that had been partially constructed by someone else. 8 months she had lived inside something she had found and stayed in and fought for and made real. The arithmetic was not complicated. She turned off the last light and went down the hall to the room she slept, in the room with the window that faced east, so the morning came in early, and direct the room she had chosen because she wanted to be woken by the light rather than by an alarm. A preference she had always had and had never before been in a position to act on. Small things. The accumulation of small things chosen freely. That was what a life made on your own terms actually felt like, not triumphant, not dramatic, but solid and specific and entirely your own. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the familiar language of wood and temperature that she had learned to hear as what it was, a structure that had endured and been found, and was now finally being lived in by someone who intended to stay.